So with their performance at Cluj, the Brazilians over at Luminosity have now taken their third top 8 finish at a Valve major for the year, securing themselves legend status for the next major, probably the first one of 2016 to be, automatically invited to that event due to that placement. And with the placement also, they are the most successful non-European team at the Valve sponsored majors as well for the year, and one of the most successful non-European teams overall. With Cloud9, of course, having their run of 3 second place finishes. That, of course, was probably one of the bigger highlights for NACS when it comes to performance. But Luminosity has certainly been right behind them in some of the placements and the showings that they've been able to demonstrate this year. And so basically with this video, as I wanted to cover a little bit about the history of this team, though I will be primarily focusing on the very recent past and, of course, focusing on their performance at Cluj and what their outlook looks for the future. So, how do we get Luminosity Gaming? Well, the way that this team really kind of came together was sometime in October of 2014. You saw some type of merger kind of take place between rosters. You had the Kaboom TD lineup, which was featuring, Fallen and Fur, as well as like FNX and a couple of other players. They were on that team, the one that competed in ESWC 2014 for Brazil. And then you had the Pro Gaming TD team, which that is the team that featured zqks, Bolts, and Steel. I believe Kogu may have played with them a little bit or something like that as well. But, at some point after that ESWC 2014 placement to prepare for this year, 2015, whenever they would be going to MLG XGames Aspen in January of the year, there was some type of merger that took place where, Steel, Bolts, and zqks would join up with Fur and Fallen on the Kaboom lineup, and that's the name they would use. It would be Kaboom, and they did go to MLG XGames Aspen in January of 2015, as well as playing ClutchCon in Colorado, which was the weekend after Aspen. And this is where this team really kind of made a splash. This is where we first started getting some types of hints that this team might be able to do something. And it was off the back of a couple of best-of-1 wins, right? They beat Cloud9 on Mirage in the group stage of this event. Later on, they didn't really do much after that at Aspen. They got eliminated pretty handedly shortly after beating Cloud9 and upsetting them. Now, to this day, we know that Cloud9 has always had issues with Mirage, but this was still a pretty big statement so early on. Most people felt that despite the map strengths, no one really knew what to expect from Kaboom, for one. And most people thought that Cloud9, being a top North American team at the time, should be able to handle such an unknown value, but it didn't work out that way. And then later on, just the next weekend, they also beat Fnatic at the time, the undisputed best team in the world coming off the end of 2014 with their performances at the end of the year, and beat them on Mirage, a very strong map for Fnatic. And at first, I think that many people felt that this team might be like a one-trick pony, like they were just a really good Mirage team and they weren't going to be able to do much else. And I have to give them credit, though, just for this. A lot of people in the North American scene especially always kind of complain that they lack the resources to be a great team. There's not proper practice. There's not a lot of good teams to scrim against. At times people felt there wasn't enough financial support to really be able to build together, full-time teams that could really put in the time that was needed to compete with the Europeans. There were all these different constraints and hurdles that people kind of put in front of the teams in North America, for sure. But here you have this team from Brazil who probably has even worse conditions to use to be able to be a proper team and prepare properly and compete at a serious level. And here they are beating teams like Cloud9 and Fnatic. Yeah, sure, they were both wins on Mirage, but that's still special in itself, because you can see how at this point in time, and even for the future, based on comments we saw from certain pro players, I think MBK famously from what would become Envious, I think they were still LDLC at the time, kind of said, this team, Kaboom, has taught us how to play Mirage. In the sense that they developed the meta of that map. They implemented a new 5-smoke execute on the A bomb site, which was the first time we had ever seen that. It kind of combined a 3-smoke setup that went through the center of the A bomb site that Navi had kind of developed earlier in 2014, but it also combined that 3-smoke setup with a couple of deeper smokes in jungle and connector to have this really crazy 5-smoke execute that caught people way off guard. Didn't really know how to deal with it, and that's part of the reason why they were probably able to beat teams like Cloud9 and Fnatic. But still, being able to develop a new strategy for the map, a new way of doing things. Like I said, developing the meta of a particular map. I mean, this is incredible stuff. It really proved that with enough time and effort, you can find ways to win, even if you lack for a bit of firepower or experience, by coming up with new tactics that people haven't seen before. And it was very impressive to watch them bring this out. Now, later on in the year, very shortly afterwards, in fact, I think sometime in February or March, they were able to qualify for Katowice, which would be their first major of the year. One of the big games that they won to do this was a game against Dignitas on Inferno. This is the Dignitas that was being led by Fetish, and they beat him. So good run there. Then they actually go to Katowice in March, and they beat Hellraisers on Inferno. So another good Inferno victory, so showing some ability to play some other maps outside of Mirage. Beat CLG on D2, and then they went on to play Virtus Pro in the quarterfinals, where they actually were able to take a map off of Virtus Pro, actually beat them in overtime on Overpass, which would prove to be a good map for the team throughout this year, especially in a league play. We'll talk about that in a second. But they severely lose on Mirage, which is the map we thought they would be great on. But again, Virtus Pro is such a great Mirage team. And I think people were starting to kind of now watch this team, understand what they were doing to be able to counter it better. They also had a big loss on Nuke, which doesn't even exist in the map pool anymore. So after that happens, I believe this is around the time that we see them get picked up by Keyed Stars, and they make their move to North America, and it's announced that they will be competing in Season 1 of this combined ESEA ESL Pro League. Okay, and when they come over, they pretty much dominate the league. I mean, I think they might have split maps with Cloud9 and Liquid, because there was like 22 matches played in the season. You played each team twice. That was in the Pro League. So I think they split maps with Cloud9 and Liquid and maybe CLG as well, but they still had a very, very good record. I think their wins were like in the high teens and their losses were in the low single digits. I can't remember the exact record, but it was a pretty dominant record. I think they qualified with the second seed from the North American side to go on and play in the finals of this event, which took place in July, where they were able to beat TSM, which was a team that was certainly really making a name for themselves. I mean, they had their top 3 finish at Aspen, which Kaboom was at, and TSM had been slowly proving themselves to be one of the top teams in the world and soon to be a title contender. I think they even won some titles by this point in time. And they beat them on Inferno. So another good Inferno victory here for this team. They do lose to CLG on Cash, which I think Cash has been proven to be pretty much the weakest map for this team, or one of the weakest maps for this team, and CLG a very comfortable team on Cash. So, a big result here for CLG, but a loss for this team, which means they didn't have to go on and play against Fnatic to try to make it through the quarterfinals process of this event, since CLG was able to skip straight to the semifinals off of some best-of-1 wins, whereas obviously this Keyed Stars team doesn't have that happen. And when they play Fnatic, they get beat on Inferno and Train, though Train was pushed into overtime, so still a pretty decent showing here from what at the time was Keyed Stars. However, things take a drastic turn after having some impressive stuff throughout most of the year with how they did at Katowice and how they were doing in the North American scene while they were competing in the ESL-ESEA Pro League. All these things look like things are going great. But then all of a sudden they had this really, really tough run in July at the ESWC 2015, where in the group play stages they lose to Cloud9 on Overpass, which was a map, remember, that they had looked quite good on. They had beaten Virtus Pro on it at Katowice in online league play. It had seemed that, Mirage was still their bread and butter, but Overpass was really looking to be kind of the next map that was going to be a big map for them. So losing to Cloud9 on Overpass, which I think this is when Cloud9 first starts getting some results or starts putting some good showings and putting some work into Overpass. I think it's around the same time period, but still disappointing loss there for that map. They also wound up losing to Flipside Tactics, which of course this is when Hiko was standing in for that team. They didn't even have their full 5. Yeah, they still had a very rising star and Simple, but it still wasn't even a full team. They were having major communication issues, all these different things, and they wound up losing here on Kabul. And then I think they beat like Boreal, which was some local Canadian team. So they had one win in the group play, but it still wasn't enough to get them to the actual playoffs. And then after this event ends, we see them make a huge roster change. This is around the same time that you also see the French Shuffle take place when, Titan and Envious kind of mix their players into the current versions you see today. This is around the same time. This team also goes through a little bit of a change, though it's not quite a big one. Really, the only change that is made is zqks is dropped from the team, and they picked up a player by the name of Cold. And I think this was to address some issues that the team was having. There was a lot of criticism about this team, though they did have some good results in the year, that they lacked for a bit of firepower. Most people felt that the main tool that they had to really be able to put up numbers was Fur. Fur was kind of the guy that was their star player. He was the one that seemed like he could actually compete fragging-wise with some of the better players in the world. Yet, as far as the rest of the lineup goes, they didn't really seem to have that oomph to really push them over the edge. I mean, Fallen would have some good games here or there. You know, usually one of the two between Bolts and Steel would have a decent game, but usually they wouldn't both have a good game at the same time. So it seemed like they lacked for a bit of firepower. One of the other criticisms that the team seemed to be facing was there was a lot of criticism about their map pool not being deep enough. Yeah, sure, we knew they had their Mirage, though they even started losing some games on Mirage most recently, so one of their big map strengths began to kind of turn on them. They were developing some stuff on Inferno and Dust 2. We had seen some good results in those two maps. And Overpass was another map where we saw them get a big land victory on it against Virtus Pro at Katowice, and in online league play in North America, the Overpass seemed to be pretty strong. They were working on Cobble, but it still wasn't quite there yet. And obviously, we already talked about how they're very weak on Cache, which is a big map, especially in North America. And so for them to have struggles on such a popular map like Cache, that certainly hurt them. Their train was really hit or miss, it seemed. Some good results, but also some poor ones. It was weird. Like, there was so many maps where they had a winning record. Like, maybe they, in the North American League play between some of the online tournaments and in the Pro League for ESL, ESEA, because they weren't competing in CEVO at this particular time period. They'd have like maybe 4 wins and 3 losses, or like 2 wins and 1 loss. So it wasn't like a really strong win rate really on any map across the map pool besides maybe Mirage and, like I said, maybe Overpass. So that was another big criticism this team had. So I think bringing in Cold was to kind of address this lack of firepower, because Cold comes onto this team being kind of a secondary entry fragger, kind of their second aggressive rifler next to Fur. And we'll see shortly as we talk about some of their most recent results that he frags really well. He does add a lot of firepower to this team from a rifling position next to Fur. But the other big thing that happens here when they bring in Cold is that with zqks gone, who was their primary opper at the time, or Fallen was more of a secondary op when they did run a 2-op setup, which they did do quite a bit on maps like Dust 2, for example. But for the most part, if the money didn't allot for it, or depending on what they were trying to do, it was always zqx opping and Fallen being more of a supportive rifler. But with zqks gone, Fallen does become the primary op on this team, as well as still continuing to be the in-game leader for the lineup. And this is great news, because we've really seen Fallen with the AWP be quite effective. I mean, short of some of his performances at Cluj, when you look at all the different North American League play and tournaments they've played over the past couple of months from publishing this video, when you look at some of the maps they did at Cologne, as well as, you know, even looking at some of the maps that they did do well on at Cluj, I guess prior to their best of 3 against Navi, he's looked really impressive. He's been one of the top oppers competing in the North American scene. I know they're not a North American team, but obviously they compete in the NA leagues right now, and yeah, Skadoodle's always been regarded as the best. JDM's really making a presence for himself in this scene as well lately, but Fallen really kind of has been definitely a top 3 opera competing in the NA scene, if not, you know, number 2. And with Skadoodle struggling a bit, you know, there's some debate there. But so basically you went from a team where you had Fur, and then most people felt that was all they had, to now you have Fur still performing well. You have Cold, you know, who comes in as another very explosive rifler for this team. And then Fallen has been quite effective with the op. And it seems like their tactics haven't suffered much. You know, a lot of people always kind of say that there's kind of this balance that takes place where, yeah, you have an in-game leader, maybe strategically you're looking good, but that's going to take away from his ability to frag. Where it seems like Fallen, for the most part, it hasn't affected him too much. He's still leading the team quite well. The team still works very well tactically. And you have 3 players now on this team between Fallen, Fur, and Cold that are able to produce fragging-wise. And when you now think about how this team operates, they've always been a team that had like a slower, more methodical style for the most part, very default-oriented, very spread across the map, kind of work information, execute in the last 20 or 30 seconds of the round. That's the general style of team that they have, where essentially you pair up cold with bolts, maybe steel sometimes, but usually it's kind of cold and bolts together. So you kind of take a passive, more supportive rifler and pair them up with one of your more aggressive riflers, and you have fur paired up with steel usually, and you just kind of put them on opposite ends of the map, and you just kind of work it while falling somewhere in between with the yacht floating around. That's kind of their general style. But they also mix in some pretty cool fast executes, right? I mean, everyone has their fast long B hits, for example, on Cobble, and this team is no different. And they also, have their really, really cool B splits on overpass. They're really quick with Fur and Cold kind of leading the way, as well as Fallen's Op maybe coming out long B. So, I mean, they have some faster stuff as well. I don't want to get too in depth on how they play every single map. I'd be here forever, but that's kind of their general style, and it's worked out very, very well. They work good as a team. They trade frags really well together, and now they have some real playmakers on the team also. It's around this same time, too, when they pick up Cold, that they also change organizations once again. They get picked up by Luminosity Gaming. Away from Keyed Stars, they continue to be able to operate in North America as LG continues to fund them having a team house. And now they've expanded, and they're still competing in the ESEA Pro League, but now they're also competing in the CEVIL MLG Pro League. They're doing some stuff with PGL and Face It and different things. So they're really expanding their presence and becoming a really, really big team at this point. So then we go into Cologne, which is the major before Cluj, and this is their first LAN event with Cold, and we see them once again being able to place top 8. They kick things off by a strong performance on Overpass, beating Kingwin 16-6. This is where you really first see that this trio of Fur, Fallen, and Cold can be quite effective. They just had sick production throughout this entire event. I think when you look at all 3 best of ones they played in the group stages, Fur, Cold, and Fallen were almost always in the 20s in every single map they played. Granted, they did play an overtime against Envy where they lost on Cobble, and then they played a double overtime against Flipside Tactics, so that obviously gives you more rounds to play with to get those numbers. But they still look quite good throughout this event. And so, I already kind of noted that they beat Kingwin. They lose to Envy, but still a very good performance against such a top team, just barely losing there in overtime, and then beating Flipside to make it on to the quarterfinals, where they will be matched up against Fnatic. Now, when they play against Fnatic here, they do lose train pretty harshly, if we're honest. It wasn't even really competitive, but they make a great run on Mirage, their classic map that we always, think of them for. 14-16 loss here. Fur and Cold, again, have a great game. This time, Fallen's a little bit off. But it's still a very competitive game. And I'll also kind of note here that I haven't really talked a whole bunch about Bolts and Steel, but it seems like one of those two have a good game, especially if one of the trio I mentioned is having a bit of an off game. It seems like one of the two between Steel and Bolts will really kind of step up and fill the gap a bit. I guess it's usually more Bolts, but usually one of those two are also playing pretty well, whereas maybe the other is a little bit short, but still round up to be a pretty good team firepower wise, and of course tactically very sound. And again, another great result here at Cologne, getting a top 8 finish and looking impressive against at least one of the maps they played on against the best team in the world at the time, which was Fnatic. Now after Cologne, we do see that this team kind of maybe cools off a bit in their online North American League play. I mean, they were fairly dominant in the first season of ESEA, as we've already mentioned that before. But now we start seeing them have a little bit of struggle against some of the teams like CLG and Liquid, whereas in the past they seem to be able to usually be a favorite against them. So I think I first kind of noticed this when we saw CLG beat them in the grand finals of the win-out LAN we had in North America, and just the past couple of months where they lost to them, I think 4 maps to 2 in back-to-back best-of-3s. All the maps were horribly one-sided. It was like CLG would win a map really one side, like 16-2, 16-3. Then LG would turn around and beat them 16-2, 16-3 or something like that. And then CLG would come back and beat them in the final map or whatever. That's pretty much how it played out throughout the entire grand final. So that was odd to see them just. And then some of these maps that they lost to CLG were maps we thought that LG was a bit better than CLG on, or was a bit of a strength for LG. So this was a bit surprising to see that kind of happen. We also see them lose to Liquid in the finals of the PGL North American qualifiers, as well as at the iBuyPower Fall Invitational. But I feel like this is more of a sign of Liquid getting better as a team and strengthening, how they play. I mean, obviously this is when they picked up Hiko, and we've seen now Liquid go on to do pretty well when we look at the Cluj qualification process, and even looking good at Cluj against teams, especially their overtime loss to Virtus Pro, and and even looking competitive elsewhere throughout the tournament, as well as beating Fnatic on Kabla at the PGL final. So I think this is more of a sign of Liquid getting stronger than Luminosity fading away. But when I was talking to a Dren from Liquid, I did an interview with him before Cluj. He kind of mentioned that he felt part of the reason why Luminosity was starting to not be as strong in NA is because now they weren't an X factor or a surprise anymore. People were figuring them out. They were paying them attention. They were scouting them more, and they were figuring them out, So I think that when they first came to North America, they were this crazy unknown value. People were a bit intimidated by them even and kind of showed them too much respect. And now you were starting to see some of the NA teams get better, for one. I think CLG with their role swaps and stuff have just become a stronger team. We've already talked about how Liquid's gotten better. So I think it's, like I said, more of a sign of the NA teams getting better, and also just, Luminosity getting discovered more, not having any tricks up their sleeve that people weren't prepared for anymore. They weren't an unknown value any longer. Now people, with their results at Cologne and Katowice and just throughout the, first half of 2015, people were now a bit concerned about this team and actually thought that, this was a threat worth considering. And so you kind of see that happen. Also, during the ESL Season 2 Pro League, we did see them lose some games you didn't really expect them to lose. I mean, I think they lost to Complexity on Overpass, which was weird. They lost to Winter Fox in Overpass, so now they're losing this Overpass map we thought they were quite good on. They also even lost a game to Method on Dust 2. In the SEVO League, they had some map losses to Enemy and Denial. So these were some games where we're just like, whoa, this is really odd. And I think more so than just the results, we also saw them struggling with their map pool again here. They were changing up their bans. They were, for some reason, playing Cash more, even though it was such a weak map for them. They were willing to play it, and they were struggling on it. They were, like I said, they didn't really have a consistent banning phase. I mean, it seems like they're a team that doesn't really necessarily ban their weaknesses so much as they focus on counter banning their opponent. So their bans and stuff are all over the place, and I feel like they still do, to some degree, struggle on focusing on a collection of maps. They try to just play all of them, and some of them they need to avoid, which I think at the major at Cluj they did smartly avoid Cash, when they needed to throughout the tournament. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is when they were heading to Cluj, obviously they didn't have to qualify for Cluj. They were already a legend from playing in Cologne. Some of their NA League play, back like Liquid's looking hot going into Cluj, CLG's looking about normal, and people were worried, whoa, has Luminosity fallen off a little bit concerned. But it's not all that bad. They still qualified for the SEVO Season 8 finals, which is about to take place, a few days after I post this video. They're currently ranked 3rd in ESEA, so they seem to still be well on their way to qualifying for that event, which is going to be in LA. So it's not all bad. And then we actually see them at Cluj, right? And before Cluj, they did this European boot camp for a week or two, which apparently really helped them out, from what I understand. And they opened up the tournament by playing against Cloud9 on Dust 2, which this is a map that Cloud9 has had some struggles on over the past few months. I won't get too much into that, but Luminosity kicking off things great here. They have a 5-0 start on the CT side, so come off blaze, and they kind of cool down a bit and wound up still winning the first half, though, 8-7. But then on the Terrace side, they close out the game with very little trouble with 8 rounds again. Cold looks absolutely nuts here. He drops 31 frags and really carries the team. Really starting to prove his worth here. I mean, obviously, he had already had a strong tournament in Cologne. He had done well in some of the online NA League play, but here he shows he can even carry the team when people like Fur and Fallen are not doing so hot. And here we also see Steel and Bolts be able to step up and frag pretty well next to Cold, despite the fact that a couple of the other star players are having a tough game, and they beat, it's still a solid team in Cloud9 on Dust 2 to open up the tournament. And so that teaches us a lot about this team, that the firepower thing doesn't really seem to be so much of an issue anymore, and they still look brilliant as a team. And then here's the huge shocker, right? They beat Fnatic on Inferno, which is like just unheard of. Like, Fnatic's such a good Inferno team, especially known for their lockdown CT shots. So that does not happen here. We do see the game start off as expected. I mean, Luminosity only gets 7 rounds in the first half on CT side, so this seems like Fnatic taking care of business, no problem. Then we switch sides, and Luminosity is able to come up with 9 rounds. And this is despite the fact that Flusha, Olaf, and Krims all played a decent game, all fragging within the 20s. So it wasn't even as if, Krims and Olaf or Flusha or any of those guys were just like bombing it, like only dropping like low double digits or something. No, these guys were in the 20s. They were fragging pretty well throughout the game. I guess mostly in the first half when they were getting their 8 rounds on Terra's side. But nonetheless, you see Cold, Fur, and Fallen, that trio that you think are going to be bringing the firepower, all of them also fragging plus 20 kills, and they win the game 16-13. This is a very impressive result. Again, starting to prove to some critics that they now do have the firepower to compete with the best in the world. They still have, you know, the tactics to be a good team, and this was just a very, very bold statement that was made here at Cluj by Luminosity to get that map win against Fnatic. They then go on to play Na'Vi in the quarterfinals, where, of course, they again get 0-2'd. Same with Cologne, where they got 0-2'd by Fnatic, though I guess at Katowice they did win a map in the quarterfinals there against Virtus Pro. Here, though, both maps are so close, and you really could see how Luminosity could have just done it, could have just moved on to the semifinals. They weren't too far off from it. For example, on Dust 2, where they lose 14-16, very close game. You know, Luminosity has a decent first half. Has a decent first half with 6 rounds on Terra's side. Not the best Terra's side, but it's manageable to work with. But the real problem here is that while Fur winds up dropping 31 kills this game and really carrying the team, you see Cold really off to a slow start in the first half. He kind of comes alive in the second half to try to help them start closing the gap and make a bit of a comeback effort when they switch over to the CT side, but he really had an off Terra's side. Fallen has an off game the entire game. He just didn't show up at all this game. Hate to say it, his op just wasn't doing anything for his team on this map, and they really missed him. If Fallen could have had any presence in this Dust 2 game, that probably would have been enough to push them over the edge and actually be able to take this map, but it just doesn't happen. Cold and Bolts both frag in the 20s, actually, so again, they do show the capability of showing up and kind of filling the gap if some of the star players are having an off game, but it still wasn't enough. You needed at least one between Fallen and Cold to really get their game going again, and it just didn't happen, and they lose this map by 2 rounds. You then move on to Overpass, again, another very tight game, 13-16 lost. You know, good start from Luminosity. They get 9 rounds on the CT side in the first half. You know, you want double digits here, sure, but 9's not bad. Could have been able to get it, but again, you kind of see Cold being a bit off in this game, similar to Dust 2, and again, Fallen not really having one of his best games either, not getting near the 20s like we had seen them in some of the best of 1 games, and you know, throughout this year since they got Cold in the lineup and kind of swapped their roles around. And that's pretty much their tournament. They once again get eliminated in the quarterfinals, but that's still 3 majors this year where they've been able to get into the top 8. No non-European team can claim that level of success at the Valve majors, so that's, you know, a good showing from them. Their North American League play has still looked pretty good. They're still looking like one of the top 3 teams competing in the region and qualifying for some of the big and A lands like the ones going on with CEVO and MLG and ESEA and ESL. They seem to be growing as a team. Like I said, when you look at them at the beginning of January and how they look then compared to now, they seem to be working better on their map pool. They're starting to find some other maps outside of Mirage and Overpass where they could put up some results. Cobble seems to be shaping up pretty good for them. Inferno has been a good map for them as well. Dust 2. So they're beginning to work on things. Obviously, their cache is still quite weak, and that could use some work. Train seems to be a map they don't play a whole lot that could use some work there as well. But looking better as a team, especially firepower. Cold's really proved his worth in this team. Fallen's looking good with the op, and Fur's still the same Fur from the beginning of the year who can be an impact rifler on the team. And I think the other big thing is that this team makes the most of things rather than complain as some other teams would. I kind of hinted on this earlier in the video where you see some of the North American teams really, you know, complain about not getting proper practice and, you know, having issues getting scrims and things of this nature. Whereas way back in the day, when Kaboom's sitting here in Brazil, like the core of this lineup, you know, minus Cole plus zqks, these guys probably didn't have much practice either, yet they were still pushing themselves to develop new strategy and are developing the meta of maps, you know, particularly Mirage at the beginning of the year. Not to mention that this team has been living, you know, at a team house similar to what CLG does now these days in North America for pretty much all this year. You know, ever since Aspen going forward for the most part, or maybe sometime in March. So they've been there for, you know, 6-7 months, competing in the NA League. So very similar situation to some of the other teams in NA. Yet they are putting up the results that some of the NA teams cannot do. So again, they make the most of, you know, a situation, or they expose the fact that this particular situation that's supposed to eliminate 8 teams is in fact a myth, that you can in fact still succeed. So just wanted to make a video to talk, a bit about the Brazilians here in Luminosity Gaming, talk about their history, focus a lot on their recent past, and especially how they were able to do at some of the most recent majors they played in at Cologne and Cluj, as well as talk a little bit about some of the strengths of the team, now having the firepower, still looking good as a team, some of the weaknesses, still working on that map pool. But I think this team has a great future. I think their outlook looks bright, and I think we'll continue to see this team, competing for a top 8 in the world spot. Hopefully they can get to some more LAN events. So that's, I think, one of the big hurdles they face, is that we very rarely see them in European tournaments unless it is a Valve major. So you see them in Europe maybe once every 3 or 4 months. But they do have some good North American lands coming up between the iBuy Power Cup, IEM San Jose, and the CEVO land. So they're going to get some 3 opportunities here in November to start proving themselves even more in the scene. And then hopefully next year we'll see them be able to compete more internationally, and hopefully they'll continue to grow, because it's going to be really cool to see, a non-European team, a team outside of what you expect to be kind of the heartland of top-level CSGO, this Brazilian team from the outside being able to creep their way in and be a top team in the world. So just wanted to talk a bit about them. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to follow and subscribe for more, please do so. Thanks a lot.